In Episode 10, titled Selecting Tests, t-test versus chi-squared versus ANOVA in scenarios, the goal is to choose common statistical tests quickly by focusing on the type of data you have and the question the scenario is actually asking. DataX does not reward memorizing a long catalog of tests, but it does reward the ability to match a situation to the right test family without getting pulled toward whatever sounds most technical. When you read an exam prompt, the correct test is usually determined by a small number of cues, such as whether the outcome is numeric or categorical, how many groups are being compared, and whether the data points are independent. If you can identify those cues early, you will avoid a large class of distractors that offer plausible but mismatched tests. This episode will build a clean mental sorting system that lets you pick the right test under time pressure and then interpret it responsively. The goal is not to turn you into a statistician, but to make test selection feel like a practical, professional habit. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to the DataX books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A very common scenario pattern is comparing means between two groups, and that is where the t-test typically applies. A t-test is used when the outcome you care about is numeric, such as time, cost, score, or revenue, and you want to compare the average value between two groups. The groups might be two versions of a process, two customer segments, or before versus after conditions, and the question often asks whether the difference in means is meaningful. The exam is unlikely to demand that you compute a t-statistic by hand, but it will expect you to recognize that this is a mean comparison problem, not a category association problem. A distractor might suggest a chi-squared test because it is a familiar name, but if the outcome is a measured number and the question is about average differences, the t-test family is the right conceptual fit. When you learn to connect two groups plus numeric outcome to t-test thinking, you can select the correct answer quickly. When the scenario involves comparing means across three or more groups, that is where analysis of variance, often shortened as ANOV, after you have said analysis of variance the first time, becomes the standard conceptual tool. The key cue is that you still have a numeric outcome, but now the grouping variable has three or more levels, such as 3 pricing tiers, multiple regions, or several versions of a process. The exam may ask whether any group differs from the others in a meaningful way, and analysis of variance is designed to test for differences across multiple group means without doing many separate pairwise t-tests. This matters because repeated pairwise testing increases false positives unless you control for multiple comparisons, and the exam expects you to avoid that trap when the prompt implies several groups. Analysis of variance tells you whether there is evidence that at least one group mean differs, and follow-up analysis can identify where differences lie, but the main selection is driven by the 3+ groups cue. If you remember that analysis of variance is the mean comparison tool for more than two groups, you will choose it more confidently. Another very common scenario pattern is association between categorical variables, and that is where the chi-squared test typically applies. A chi-squared test is used when you have counts or categories and you want to know whether there is a relationship between them, such as whether purchase behavior differs by segment, whether churn status is associated with a feature, or whether outcomes are distributed differently across groups. The outcome here is not a numeric measurement like time or cost, but a category like yes versus no, Group A versus Group B, or multiple category bins. The exam may present contingency table language indirectly, describing counts of events across categories, and the correct test family is the one that evaluates association rather than mean differences. A distractor might try to pull you toward a t-test because it is well known, but a t-test assumes numeric outcomes and compares averages, which does not match categorical association. When you connect counts across categories to chi-squared thinking, you are using the same mental sorting professionals use when deciding whether to compare means or compare distributions of categories. Independence assumptions matter across these tests, and DataX expects you to confirm independence conceptually before trusting results. Independence means that one observation does not influence another in a way that breaks the test's assumptions about variability and sampling. In many real data sets, observations can be clustered, repeated, or time-linked, such as multiple records from the same customer, repeated measurements of the same device, or sequential events from the same process. If independence is violated, a test may produce p-values that look impressive but are misleading because the effective sample size is smaller than it appears. The exam may hint at dependence through wording like repeated measures, before and after on the same subjects, or multiple observations per entity, and that hint is there to guide your choice. The best answer often involves choosing a paired design test when appropriate, or acknowledging that independence must be addressed in design or analysis. When you treat independence as a gate you check before trusting a test, you align with professional statistical discipline rather than treating test names as magical. A related decision is whether the comparison is paired versus independent, and that is determined by the collection design rather than by the topic label in the question. Paired designs occur when the same entity is measured twice, such as before and after an intervention on the same users, or when observations are naturally matched, like twin samples or matched customer pairs. Independent designs occur when the two groups are distinct sets of entities, such as two different user groups exposed to different conditions without overlap. This distinction matters because paired tests remove within-subject variation and often provide more sensitivity, but only when the pairing is real. The exam may not say paired, but it will describe the collection design, and you must infer whether observations are linked. Choosing an independent test when the design is paired can waste power and misrepresent uncertainty, while choosing a paired test when the groups are independent is incorrect because there is no valid pairing structure. DataX rewards careful reading of the scenario's data collection design because it signals that you understand what the data actually represents. Sometimes normality assumptions fail badly, and the exam expects you to recognize that non-parametric alternatives exist when the data behavior makes parametric assumptions questionable. Non-parametric approaches are often used when distributions are heavily skewed, have extreme outliers, or are ordinal rather than truly numeric in a meaningful way. The exam usually tests this conceptually by describing data that is clearly non-normal, such as long-tailed response times or values with a few huge spikes, and then asking which approach is appropriate. The key here is not memorizing every alternative test name, but recognizing that mean plus normal assumptions may be fragile in some scenarios, and that robust methods may be more appropriate. In professional reasoning, you would often inspect distribution shape and consider transformation or robust tests, and DataX rewards that mindset. The wrong answer in these scenarios is often the one that blindly applies a standard test without acknowledging that assumptions are violated. When you see strong skew or outliers described, you should become cautious about default parametric choices and more open to robust alternatives. A practical way to improve speed is to map prompts to tests using simple keywords, because the exam often signals the test family through plain language. Words that imply average, mean, increase, or difference in score point toward mean comparison thinking, which suggests t-test or analysis of variance depending on how many groups are involved. Words that imply relationship, association, distribution across groups, or counts in categories point toward chi-squared thinking. Phrases like before and after for the same users point toward paired design logic, while phrases like two separate groups of users point toward independent design logic. These cues are not foolproof, but they are strong enough that they help you make the first cut quickly, after which you verify with data type and design assumptions. The exam rewards this cue-based speed because it prevents you from getting bogged down in test name trivia and keeps your attention on scenario meaning. When your brain learns to hear these cues automatically, you will find that test selection becomes a pattern recognition task rather than a stressful recall challenge. It is also important to avoid choosing tests based on tool familiarity alone, because familiarity is not the same as appropriateness. In real work, people often run the test they remember how to run, especially under time pressure, and that is one of the reasons analytic results can be misleading. The exam uses this behavior against you by offering familiar test names as distractors, knowing many learners will pick the comfortable option rather than the correct match. The disciplined approach is to match the test to the measurement type and the question, and then consider assumptions and design. If you practice that discipline, you are not only improving exam performance, but also reinforcing professional integrity in analysis. DataX tends to reward answers that reflect principled selection rather than convenience-based selection. When you feel the pull of familiarity, treat it as a signal to return to the basics of data type, group count, and dependent structure. Sample size limits are another factor because some tests rely on approximations that can break when data is sparse. Chi-squared tests, for example, can be unreliable when expected counts in categories are very small, and the exam may hint at sparse data through language about rare events, small group sizes, or many categories with few observations each. In mean comparison settings, very small sample sizes can make normal approximations and variance estimates unstable, increasing uncertainty and making conclusions fragile. The exam typically does not ask you to calculate expected counts, but it may ask what concern applies or what adjustment is appropriate when sample size is limited. A common distractor is to treat any test output as trustworthy regardless of sample adequacy, which is not sound reasoning. DataX rewards the learner who recognizes that small samples and sparse categories can invalidate simplistic conclusions, and that the right response may involve collecting more data, combining categories, or using more appropriate methods. This is again judgment over memorization, because you are being tested on whether you know when a method's conditions are not met. Even when the correct test is chosen, interpretation matters, and the exam expects you to interpret p-values alongside effect sizes and context rather than treating significance as proof of importance. A small p-value suggests that the observed result would be unlikely under the null hypothesis, but it does not tell you whether the difference is large enough to matter or whether the underlying assumptions are trustworthy. Effect size provides magnitude, which is what decision-makers care about, and context provides stakes and constraints, which determine what magnitude is meaningful. You can have a statistically significant difference in means that is operationally trivial, and you can have a practically meaningful difference that is not statistically significant because the test is underpowered. The exam often rewards answers that acknowledge this nuance, especially in business scenarios where acting on tiny effects could waste resources. This is why the best answers often include both the concept of significance and the concept of practical relevance, even if the question does not explicitly ask for both. When you treat p-values as one input in a broader decision, you align with professional practice and exam expectations. These tests are not academic exercises in isolation, and DataX often frames them inside business decisions like pricing, retention, or operational improvement. For pricing, you might compare average revenue or average conversion across two pricing strategies, which cues mean comparison thinking and often t-test logic if there are two groups. For retention, you might ask whether churn status is associated with a categorical segment or feature, which cues chi-squared association thinking. For operational improvement, you might compare means across multiple process variants, which cues analysis of variance thinking when there are three or more groups. In each case, the test is only useful if it informs a decision, meaning you must interpret the result through consequences and risk tolerance. The exam rewards you for keeping that decision link intact because it shows you understand why the test is being performed at all. When you can connect test selection to the business decision being supported, your answers become more coherent and easier to defend. A clean memory anchor for test selection is to separate mean comparisons from category relationships and then choose accordingly. If the outcome is numeric and you are comparing averages, you are in t-test or analysis of variance territory depending on the number of groups and the design. If the outcome is categorical and you are asking whether categories are associated, you are in chi-squared territory under the appropriate conditions. Then you verify design details like independence and pairing, because those details refine the correct choice within the family. This anchor is simple, but it works because most test selection errors come from mixing numeric and categorical reasoning. Under exam pressure, a simple anchor prevents you from overcomplicating what is essentially a classification decision about the question itself. When you apply the anchor consistently, you will find that the test names become less intimidating because they are simply labels for a small set of common decision patterns. To conclude episode 10, classify 3 scenarios in your mind and then name the right test, because repetition turns these distinctions into reflex. One scenario should involve comparing a numeric outcome between two groups. One should involve comparing a numeric outcome across 3 or more groups, and one should involve assessing association between categorical variables. For each, identify whether the design is paired or independent, and consider whether assumptions like independence and distribution behavior are plausible given the scenario wording. Then name the test family that fits and state, in one sentence, why it fits, focusing on data type and question type rather than on tool familiarity. When you can do this quickly, you have built the core skill the exam is measuring in this area, which is matching a real-world question to an appropriate inferential approach. Keep the focus on discipline selection and responsible interpretation, because that combination is what DataX rewards most consistently. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.